for example, we would have some of our athletes would do a 40K session in the morning of walking, and then they'd walk a 10K session in the afternoon. And that kind of a training volume would mean that it doesn't matter what you ate between the session in the morning and the session in the afternoon. The one in the afternoon was always low carbohydrate availability, just because there's not a chance to replace glycogen in that time frame when you've done such a heavy session in the morning. So it might be that even our high carbohydrate availability diet was actually periodised because of the way the athletes trained.
The Triathlon Show 236. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Professor Louise Burke, who is the head of sports nutrition at the Australian Institute of Sport, or the AIS. Through her career, Louise has worked both practically with applied nutrition science, as well as deep in the academic world, so she has a great perspective on both ends of the spectrum. And in recent years, much of her research has been focused on investigating the effects of low-carbohydrate diets, high-carbohydrate diets, and periodized carbohydrates diets or dietary interventions, I should say, on endurance performance. And this research is the topic of today's discussion. We'll get right into this interview after thanking our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Precision Hydration make electrolyte products that you can match to how you sweat. And in particular, if you have a lower sodium concentration in your sweat, then you don't need to replace as much electrolytes. But if you're somebody who loses a lot of sodium in your sweat, then you may need a stronger electrolyte supplement than most typical sports drinks and even electrolyte supplements would provide. And that is where some of the stronger concentrations of precision hydration products come into play. And that is what I personally use because I do lose a lot of sodium in my sweat. Also, I want to point out that Precision Hydration have a very active blog and a great newsletter. So I really recommend checking both of those resources out and potentially subscribing to the newsletter if you're interested. They have tons of great articles that they post through the newsletter, including things like how different pro athletes that they collaborate with and sponsor, how they are training. So you can get some insight into specific training programs and so on, which are among my favorite articles that I read through Precision Hydration. Either way, you can get 15% off your products with the discount code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, prescription glasses, and sunglasses. And recently, Roka has launched 2 amazing new wetsuits. We had a couple of months ago the Maverick MX, their max buoyancy wetsuit, and now just a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago perhaps, their new and revised version of the flagship model, the Maverick X2, was brought to market. So go and read about those on the Roka website if you are on the hunt for a wetsuit. And they've also recently released a new Matador sunglasses, which look really slick and have all of the design and the engineering perks that Roka eyewear typically has. Check those out and you can get 20% off your entire order with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the interview with Louise Burke. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Louise. How are you doing today?
Great, thank you. Pleased to be here.
It's nice to have you. Why don't you start by telling the listeners a bit more about yourself, what you do, and your background?
Right. Well, I'm a sports dietitian and I've just come up for 30 years of work at the Australian Institute of Sport. I was head of sports nutrition when we had a sports nutrition program, but the AIS restructured nearly 2 years ago, and all the science departments are now no longer So I have a new role. I'm technically called the Chief of Nutrition Strategy, which is mostly for my own amusement, but I'm still able to do quite a bit of research and delivering education resources, although I'm not working day to day with athletes anymore because that's not a role of the AIS any longer. But prior to that, the other 28 years of the 30 was spent leading a department where we were looking after the servicing of the whole range of elite athlete programs, and it involved a whole range of activities from counselling to education resources to running websites and doing applied research to get the evidence base. And it was a bit of everything, and along the way I sort of developed some key interests, I think, around supplements and around applied research, particularly to do with substrate utilisation and performance during exercise, and ways in which we can manipulate both energy and carbohydrate availability with effects on performance and health.
Great. Yeah. So it's been a mix of like doing a lot both on the practical side and the applied side of things, as well as the research and academic side.
That's right.
One of the really famous studies or groups of studies, I guess, that you have done and published and are still publishing is the so-called Supernova. So can you talk a bit more about that particular study and the different research questions you are trying to answer in that study and how you have gone about doing so?
Sure. So perhaps we should start with just the principle of the studies, because this was a new area of research that we got into. And it was the idea of embedding a research project into a training camp with elite athletes. So we worked first with the elite race walking community, because I already had a good connection there with one of our athletes, Jared Talent, and coach Brent Valance. And so through the work that I was doing with them, we were able to entice a group of international race walkers to come to the AIS. And we started with a small group, but eventually have built up to being able to work with 30 athletes at the one time, which is kind of chaotic. But the whole idea is that when you've got them there embedded in a training camp and have them involved as collaborators on the research project, we're able to both give them a great experience around training and learning from each other, but we've found that it's through their generosity and commitment, we're able to collect some really great data, and particularly to be able to interrogate things around performance in a way that's really applied in real life. We can hold races or have them as part of the research camps do real life races. So when we're trying to measure performance, it's much better if you can have it real life, where they're doing a race and there's the usual incentives around prize money and PBs and selection for international races as part of the mix. But because we were able at the AIS to have so much control over the training and the food that they eat during that period, we can blend the best sort of science with the best sort of practical outcomes and have confidence that what we see in terms of performance changes is a real outcome, because our athletes are so invested in finding out for themselves, but they're also doing it in real life. So it's been a great experience to work with athletes like this to try and do research that's both meaningful but has some rigour attached to it. And this is a model we've started with the Supernova series with the race walkers, but we're also doing it with other groups of athletes and different other themes. The main themes we've been working with the race walkers, and we're up to Supernova 6 planning, is looking at different ways in which we can manipulate either carbohydrate or fat utilisation during training support and then performance. And more recently, we've moved into manipulating energy availability as well. So in the early stages, we were looking at whether periodising carbohydrate availability in training would give any better benefits to a training output and then performance than being following a high carbohydrate availability approach the whole time. And we also managed to put the keto diet into the mix, because that's the extreme case of periodising carbohydrate availability, if you like, that you've removed it. And so in our early studies, we were comparing having high carbohydrate availability all the time or having no carbohydrate availability all the time, or that mix of some sessions being done with high and some sessions being done with low.
So let's talk about the results that you found in that particular study. What did you find?
First two studies where we looked at those 3 different interventions and had a performance measure before and after 3 weeks of very rigorous exposure to the diets. We found that the carbohydrate availability was the best for performance, and strangely enough, the high carbohydrate availability diet was probably even better than having the periodised approach, even though as scientists we were thinking that the way forward was to go with the periodisation. But we found that both carbohydrate approaches were better than the ketogenic diet. In fact, we've had very robust, repeatable outcomes that, in our hands at least, show that the ketogenic diet impairs performance of higher intensity endurance sport, and that it was, in our hands, explainable by remembering that the oxygen cost of burning fat to produce ATP is higher than using carbohydrate as an oxidative fuel. And so that's not going to be a problem for an athlete when they're working at 60, 70% of VO2 max. But once you start getting into much higher intensity areas, sort of the 75 to 85% of VO2 max, which is what elite athletes will be performing at when they're doing marathons or portions of cycle races or triathlons or other longer endurance events, when they get into those territories, it probably becomes an issue that the oxygen supply is the limiting factor rather than the substrate. So even though you can make the muscle better able to burn fat, if you can't get enough oxygen to the muscle to be able to do that, then that may be the limitation to performance.
And how long was the race that they did to measure performance?
So we looked at a 10,000 metre track race, which is an event that's about 40 minutes in race walking terms. And we chose that because we wanted to have some sort of a race that athletes could perform at maximally 3 weeks apart or 3.5 weeks apart. And so you can't get an athlete doing 2 marathons, for example, over that sort of distance. You can't in 3 weeks expect them to be able to back up and do a performance that's maximal, both physiologically but also psychologically. But the 10,000 metre race was something that was within their grasp, and the kind of speeds that they're working at in that race are similar to the 20K event, which is on the Olympic program. So we felt that that was a good test of performance, and even though it's not a glycogen-limited event, it's still working in the intensity domains that are important for athletes. As I said before, it's not always just what happens for the duration of the event, but the critical moments of the event where athletes need to be able to break away or sprint to a line. They're the critical events that might determine success outcomes. And so even though you might say that the average speed or intensity of a race is a bit lower than that, if your athlete can't get to the finish line first or have that another gear to be able to bring home the race, then that may be the limiting factor to their success.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, we're going to go on with some point.
Yes. So we chose the 10,000 metre track race, and it was a real life event. It was an IAAF sanctioned event, and we had the race judges and electronic timing and prize money and all the things that would make that normal for these athletes. They were, they were trying to get PBs and to get all the usual incentives from those events. So we did that before and after the first study and in the second study as well. But it just happened that because we had all the athletes in Australia for the first part of the season to do the study, many of them stayed around for a couple of weeks and then competed in our 20K National Race Walking Championships. And so even though that wasn't part of the protocol for the first study, we had a lot of people observing what happened to that race outcome. And so that sort of formed part of the question for the second study, because there'd been a lot of Twitter and social media interaction around some of the athletes who'd been in the first study who had a breakthrough performance when they went to the 20K event afterwards. And so it was felt that maybe the fact that they had had the experience with the ketogenic diet in the background might have been part of why they had a great success in the race that was 3 weeks after the event. And one of the ways in which the study, number one study results were discussed, at least in social media, was that maybe a ketogenic diet could be used like altitude training, that even though it, when you're on it, impairs performance of high-intensity exercise, that maybe when you've finished and go back to your higher carbohydrate diet and have a taper, that everything comes together physiologically. You've got a legacy from the adaptation that occurred while you're on the ketogenic diet. And then when you freshen up and go back onto the high carbohydrate diet, it leads to an integrated better performance. So in study 2, we completely replicated study 1, but then we continued for another 3 weeks after the exposure to the ketogenic diet, and we observed what happened to performance when there was that taper and restoration of carbohydrate availability, looking to see if that led to better performance than simply having trained with a high carbohydrate approach for the whole of the 6 weeks. And what we found in the second study, which is in review for publication, is that there was no sign of any extra benefit to performance. We saw again that the ketogenic diet, when you're on it, impairs high-intensity endurance performance, but then when you go back onto the high-carbohydrate diet, it doesn't leave you with any kind of a benefit like that altitude idea. So there's, in our hands at least, no benefit from being on the high-carbohydrate, also the high-fat diet as a prelude to the competition preparation.
Did those athletes bounce back to baseline after getting back onto the high carbohydrate diet, or was there still an impairment after?
Yes, it's an interesting way to look at that, because we had to compare it when you're looking at a 10,000 metre race and then a 20K performance. It's not a straight comparison. So we looked at it in 2 ways. One, just mathematically saying that 10,000 metres is half of 20K. And so what would you expect just by normalising the data? And when we looked at it from that point of view, it didn't look like the athletes had bounced back completely. They seemed to have not, or at least they performed just as well in the 20K race as they had come into the camp 6 weeks previously, whereas the group that had been training with the high carbohydrate diet actually had an improvement over their first race. So when we looked at that analysis, it looked like they'd actually had an impairment of the experience. They'd basically been there for 6 weeks and hadn't benefited from it. The other way that we looked at it was to use the IAAF point score. So the IAAF has a way of being able to look across all the events on its program so that you can compare someone high jumping with someone doing a javelin and say which one performed better against the world standards. And when we used that way of analysing the data, we saw that both groups competed equally well in the 20K race. So different ways of looking at it, but certainly there was no evidence that the ketogenic diet had given any sort of background benefit or legacy.
And in this second study, did you have only the high carbohydrate and the ketogenic groups, or did you also have the third group, the carbohydrate periodization group, like in the first study?
Yeah, we had the 3 groups, and the 3 groups were looked at separately when we looked at the 10 or 10,000 metre race pre and post that intervention. And again, we saw the same results, that the periodised diet was better than the ketogenic diet, but didn't seem to be as good as the high carbohydrate availability all the time. So that was confirming the results of the first study. But we pooled those two groups together when it came to the 20K race, so that we said they'd all had a high carbohydrate or carbohydrate supported training. So we compared that whole group with the ketogenic diet group. So that's probably a good thing to jump into there and say, well, why don't we think that our periodised approach to training support was as good as the high carbohydrate availability all the time? Because as scientists, we now think that actually being smarter about training and having a different kind of nutritional approach to each session that you do is more sophisticated than just having carbohydrate going in every session and, you know, creating high fuel availability the whole time. So it was, as I said, there was just a trend to the high carbohydrate availability being superior, but even so, it was a trend in the opposite direction to what we as scientists think might be the best approach. And so the way that we've explained that is to say, well, these were really high volume, high intensity elite athletes, and their training was so intense and had such a high workload involved that even when we were trying to provide a high carbohydrate availability diet, just the fact that they're training so hard means that sessions do become low carbohydrate availability despite what you eat. And for example, we would have some of our athletes would do a 40K session in the morning of walking, and then they'd walk a 10K session in the afternoon. And that kind of a training volume would mean that it doesn't matter what you ate between the session in the morning and the session in the afternoon. The one in the afternoon was always low carbohydrate availability, just because there's not a chance to replace glycogen in that time frame when you've done such a heavy session in the morning. So it might be that even our high carbohydrate availability diet was actually periodised because of the way the athletes trained. And, you know, perhaps the fact that they didn't become as fatigued because there weren't so many extra low carbohydrate availability sessions that we achieved through the dietary means, perhaps they were just fresher. And if we'd put a taper at the end of this 3 weeks of training, maybe there might have been a conversion to better performance at the end of it. But it's an interesting thing sometimes that you see when you work with elite athletes, that the way that they train has already made use of some of the things we're just explaining now with science. So, you know, you sometimes say to yourself, well, why do athletes train so hard? You know, why do they do such over volume or high intensity work when they're in competition preparation? And it might be just because people have by accident, or coaches have by accident over the years found that if you do this high volume and high intensity training and you do 2 sessions in a day, that creates the low carbohydrate availability environment that creates the extra adaptation that builds the mitochondria and the ability to oxidize well. So maybe coaches have achieved it through training, and we can do it in other ways through diet and explain the mechanisms underpinning it. But sometimes we mightn't be able to improve much on what the coach already knew.
Yeah, no, that's a reasonable explanation. And is this something that you tested? Because you mentioned that you've more recently been working with energy availability as well. So is that something that you've been doing in the more recent studies?
Yes. So we're midway through data collection for that. We would have liked to have finished that project this year. We had a camp in 2018 where we collected 2019 where we collected a data set, but we needed to build on the power of that by adding more subjects in our 2020 study. But unfortunately, the bushfires in Canberra in January this year meant that when the athletes arrived for our camp, we were closed down. we had to evacuate to Melbourne and create another study, a smaller study, where we couldn't do all the work that we had planned to do just because we just didn't have the facilities out of our own environment. So, and now we're in lockdown with the coronavirus, so it might be another year before we get a chance to get everybody back together and all those resources assembled so that we can finish the story. But what we were trying to do in this study was this time compare two things. What we're looking at, the effect of low energy availability on changes in hormones and different aspects of body health, but also the effect on performance. And part of the reason for putting the low energy availability story into the picture was because we're interested in it as an issue for athletic performance. But we're also thinking about, with the ketogenic diet, where you have a low carbohydrate environment but high energy availability, can we use that as a way of being able to look at the effect of low energy availability in some of the athletic populations where we see problems? Because if you think about a low energy availability scenario, athletes are getting low intakes of carbohydrate compared to their needs, as well as the low energy availability. So we're not sure whether some of the features of low energy availability could be just carbohydrate restriction or whether it's energy per se. So our protocols had a comparison between a high energy, high carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet, which is high energy but low carbohydrate, and then we've got the low energy, which is low energy plus low carbohydrate. So we were hoping that by putting those three things in comparison, we'd be able to see the effects of the lower energy availability, but also be able to tease out how much of that was due to the carbohydrate restriction and how much was due to the energy restriction.
Right, yeah. But results depending on that one then, and nothing that we can really discuss anymore at this point. Is that correct?
Yes, but one of the things we did see, which was of interest, was in terms of performance, we had, so this was a shorter study. We wanted to move away from the 3.5 week intervention with the ketogenic diet, and we found that when we did it over a 6 or 7 day period, which was sufficient, we thought, to have the effect of low energy availability being apparent, but it also gave us a chance to see how quickly the muscle can retool with the ketogenic diet to be able to be better at fat burning. And that is of interest to us because we got a lot of criticism for our early two studies, these people telling us that 3.5 weeks isn't long enough to be on a ketogenic diet to get all the benefits from it. And I mean, I'm quite happy to accept that there's a lot of different things that might be happening in the body in response to the ketogenic diet. But if the interest is around the muscle retooling to be able to burn fat, well, then we found with our most recent study that it doesn't take 3.5 weeks, it doesn't take 6 months, but it can be done in about 6 days. That's the time course of the muscle being able to adapt, to retool, to be good at fat burning. And we found very high rates of fat oxidation, up to 1.5 grams per minute, that were achieved in 6 days of a ketogenic diet, and also found in our other studies after 3.5 weeks of the ketogenic diet. And they're exactly the same rates that have been found in some of the studies that have looked at people that have been on ketogenic diets for 6 months or 2 years. So there may be other adaptations that occur with the ketogenic diet, but if the one that you're most interested in is the ability to burn fat as an exercise fuel, well, then it doesn't take that long at all.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. And speaking of that, some criticism that the study got and where it sits in terms of related to other studies, I think that that's something that we could talk about with the results that you've had about both how the ketogenic diet compares to the high-carb diet, but also the periodized carbohydrate diet. What do you think is the consensus at this point in the scientific community based on the research about these 3 different ways of doing your nutrition, so to say, based on all the available literature out there?
Yes, so we based our first study in 2015 on the original study by Steve Finney in 1983, which had looked at 4 weeks, and we had a 3.5-week block available to us, which we felt would replicate that first study. And, we went into it thinking that we were openly trying to see if ketogenic diets worked. We were, really interested to see if it did offer an opportunity to athletes that they weren't currently using. And we chose that period because we had seen it previously being done like that, and the only other information that was available were books that were being written by people proposing the ketogenic diets, and they were all writing in the books that it was taking 2 or 3 weeks to occur. So we felt that we were giving it an adequate period of time. But by the time we did the study and published it, suddenly social media was alive with this idea that you needed to go for 12 weeks or 6 months or much longer. And we received quite a bit of trolling and criticism on social media saying that we deliberately set up the study to fail by choosing a 3.5-week period of exposure. So that was a bit unfortunate that, we'd gone into it, we felt, without bias and genuine interest in seeing if this was an opportunity for athletes to get performance advantages in a different way. But, we've sort of got caught up in the diet wars that now seem to exist, where people are very black and white in the way they want to see nutrition. So looking at other studies that are available apart from ours to see, is there any evidence that there's a time course that's different? It's very difficult to make those decisions, because the studies that have done good control over the dietary interventions have really been done over 4 weeks, and there's not a lot. There's about 5 studies, and they all show that there's indications of the change to the fat utilisation in the muscle within that period of time, and that the fatigue that's associated with the early exposure to a ketogenic diet's disappeared by that stage. So we all agree that by that period there's quite substantial metabolic changes. And then we're really left with looking at what happens to people who've been on the diet for several years in a cross-sectional approach rather than an interventional approach to get any more clues. And so there's 2 studies that have taken athletes that have been on these diets for 6 months and more through their own volition. So there's no control over how they did it or why they did it, or whether they self-selected, whether they're part of a community where 100 people started it and only 20 people survived, because there's such an individual responsiveness to it. But be that as it may, when those groups of long-term adhering ketogenic diet athletes are then compared to a control group of athletes who are similar in their training and their performance characteristics, but on higher carbohydrate diets, well, the 2 studies have contrasting views. One of them would suggest that there's nothing special about what happens to metabolism being on the diet for longer, and the second study suggests that there is something different. The second study suggests that after some period of time, the athlete's able to adapt and actually stores glycogen just as readily as if they were on a high carbohydrate diet. But I think the data in that study have got some problems if you look at them closely. And so I think it's not sufficient evidence to make a complete new hypothesis about what happens with long-term ketogenic diet just based on that. And then there's a couple of other studies that we could look at where long-term athletes have done this. These are just sort of case studies, but in some of these case studies you do see evidence that when these athletes reintroduce some carbohydrate into their diet, whether it's just around some training sessions or a race, that there are some advantages to being able to have carbohydrate as a fuel. And so it would suggest that there's more interest or more complexity to the story than we currently giving credit for it. And when you listen to the anecdotes of some of those successful athletes who like to see themselves as ketogenic diet followers, you often find that in real life they do periodise, that they have periods where they're on ketogenic diet all the time, but then they have times when they introduce more carbohydrates in the higher quality training sessions or races in this sort of attempt to get the best of both worlds from fuel stores. So it'd be lovely to be able to do that controlled study for 2 years and actually make sure that you're watching everything in the time course and doing it in a very rigorous way. But I don't think any of us would have the money or the patience or the athlete contacts to be able to do the ideal study for that long.
Yeah, and the case studies are obviously very difficult to interpret because you can't be your own control if you're somebody who has been on a long-term ketogenic diet, even if you are somebody who is whether you're following that or you're periodizing, but you don't know what the results would have been on any of the other approaches, like a constant high carb or the periodized approach. Maybe you can have success on one, but you might have had even more success on another. So difficult to draw conclusions from those for sure. And
absolutely. And look, I think it brings up 2 points. I think that there are individual responses to these kinds of diets, and that what athletes and coaches need to do well is to experiment to find what works for them. But I think the other thing that's important is that there's you need to think about your event in terms of the personal characteristics that it has, and that when athletes say to me, "Oh, you're anti-keto," I say, "No, that's not true at all." What I'm just saying is that when we look at what the ketogenic diet can do or what kind of performance that it's suited to, it doesn't really work across the kinds of athletes and events that I work with that are on the Olympic program or more traditional. And so if you're thinking about doing an audit of your event of what's going to limit success, is it your ability to have a high intensity gear, or an ability to be able to either throughout the event or at critical moments in the event work at higher intensities for sustained periods? Is that the limit to success, or is it running out of glycogen as a fuel and not having the availability of another fuel source to take up the slack? And so if you look at your event and say, well, how long is it? What's the fuel cost? What are my opportunities to take in extra carbs on board during the race? Is it important for me to have the ability to burn them at high intensity? Well, then you can work out whether you're more suited to a carbohydrate-supported approach or whether the ketogenic diet might be more suitable. So it's not one or the other. It's understanding what are the needs of your event and what's the best way for you to approach it.
Yeah. And about the carbohydrate periodization, so you said that you kind of really expected it to work and it makes sense for it to work, but yet you didn't see the results. But is that something that has been looked at a lot in different studies across the research world? And what would the consensus be on carbohydrate periodization?
Look, I think it definitely works. It's just how do you achieve it and apply it? And in the studies that we did, I think the training volume swamped the ability of the carbohydrate periodization to show up its effects. But when we've worked in other studies with lower level athletes, we've collaborated with Lauriane Marquet from INSEP in Paris, and we did some studies looking at lower level triathletes and cyclists. In that group, when the training volume was lower, the carbohydrate periodization did have an effect. And so I think it's all about the calibre of athlete you're working with and the volume of training that they're doing. If we went longer with some of the elite athletes, we may find that there's ways in which the periodization of carbohydrate does have an effect, but it's more subtle because it's being added on top of the big changes that training drives, whereas in recreational level athletes, because they train less and less intensely, the carbohydrate periodization has more of an opportunity to have its effect being apparent.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that brings us to an important question. What would you say are the take-home messages on these topics for, let's start with just the normal recreational athletes that train at a more moderate volume, and then we'll go into the elite athletes at high volumes and high intensities after that?
Yeah, so look, I think the really important thing for every athlete, regardless of their calibre, is to say, what is my event about and what do I need to be able to do to perform well? And we need to look at events really carefully and individually, because you and I could do the same thing. I mean, I can run a marathon. That's what I like to do. But when I run a marathon, it's a completely different event to Eliud Kipchoge's marathon, because he can complete his marathon in 2 hours at much higher intensity than I can sustain. I'm doing a 3.5-hour marathon, and there are other people in the event that are doing 5-hour marathons. And so even though we're doing the same event, if you like, it's a different challenge for each of us, and we'll also have different opportunities in that event. So when Eliud does his race, he's got aid stations set out, and he's got special fluids there, and he's got access to them, and everything's, specially organised for him to get the best. When I do mine, it's pot luck when I get to an aid station if I can get myself to the line to get what's there, and I might get a cup that's only half full instead of full. So there are so many different nuances that make my event different to his, even though technically it's the same race. And so if we understand what our race is about from our point of view, and then think about what we need to be able to do to work well, for me it's being able to run at a constant pace that's probably around 70% of my VO2 max for 3.5 hours. I need to be able to take in carbohydrate and fluid on board as I go, and I need to find ways in which I can kind of trust that the environment's going to provide me with what I want, or for me to carry it with me to make sure I can kind of smooth out the times when it's not available. So that's different to Eliud, who's going to need to be able to run at a much higher intensity. He's going to try and take in as much carbohydrate as he can. He's going to have to train his gut to be able to absorb it. And he's also going to probably, not so much for a world record attempt, which they really pace as evenly as possible, but in some of the big city marathons where you might be doing a competitive race, you might have to build in extra strategies, being able to break away. You may want to put surges into your race to break the wheel and the pack around you so that you can make your tactical approaches. You might have to look at very hot weather events if you're going to do Tokyo, for example. And so when you're thinking about that event, you have to really drill down to what's it going to mean on the day for me to be able to do what I need to do, and how can I build that into my training program so I've got the right preparation for it. And so then the program in training gets broken down into all the different kinds of sessions and all the different kinds of nutritional strategies that you'd arrange around those sessions to get the best out of it. If you're the 5-hour marathon runner, you might be just wanting to finish. And so your kind of training is going to be completely different again. You're happy just to do long, slow stuff and just get those miles and the fatigue resistance in your legs, and just to learn how to stomach some fluid and some carbohydrate at a much lower rate and probably spread out compared to Eliud and me. And, that's the kind of training that you need to be doing. So, sometimes we don't recognise that there's such differences, whether it's based on the person or whether it's based on the particular course and the environmental characteristics of the day, that really should govern the way that we're preparing for it.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I think the Ironman is a perfect example of that, where you, on a fast Ironman course, you might have the pros go at close to 7.5 hours, and then you have still the time limit being 15, 16 or 17 hours. So you have plenty of athletes coming in at that 200% of the time of the winning pro. So it's a completely different event, of course.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's even more of a disparity.
Yeah. So what about the kind of the 80-20 sort of general nutrition tips, not just about the things that we've been talking about here, but especially for recreational athletes? What would you say are the most important things to take into consideration regarding their nutrition? Whether you're talking about, it's up to you, choose the most important points in your opinion for either or day-to-day and race nutrition.
Yeah, look, and I think in this time of self-isolation, it's even more important to understand why we eat what we eat. And yes, part of why we eat is to meet nutritional goals, and they may be more specialised when it comes to athletic performance. But there's so many other things that food does for us. It's part of ritual, it's part of social experience, sharing, it's part of enjoyment and pleasure. It's part of just, being able to identify with our tribe, if you like. We all like to take Instagram photos of what we eat. And so if you're wanting to be a normal human being that gets a lot out of food, gets the whole range of experiences and pleasure and benefits out of eating, then you need to be able to balance up all those different factors so that, yes, some of the time that you eat might be driven completely by nutritional goals, and it might be sort of fairly cutthroat and saying, well, I don't care what everyone else is doing. This is what I need to eat for my training today or my nutrition goals. But there are other times when you eat where it's all about, look, I just want to be with a group and all be doing the same thing and having fun, or I want to eat something that makes me feel good, or, I want to eat something that I can Instagram and be part of the pack. And so the 80-20 rule is kind of a good idea in saying that there needs to be some flexibility in your diet somewhere so that different aspects of what food does for you can all be expressed. It's not all just about I've got to eat this much carb and this much calories and this much iron or whatever. Sometimes it needs to be about I just want to hang out with my people and have something that we're all eating and enjoying, and it's adding another sort of value to my life.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that something that you see that elite athletes do well? They have that flexibility. They're not too rigid with how they eat.
Look, I think the best elite athletes do that. Sometimes we get athletes who are so rigid in their thinking about nutrition that it's all very technical and very driven by nutrient needs. They're often moving too much in the same direction. But if we can get the balance right so that everything can get met at the same time, I think that's a much better athlete approach.
Right. Sorry, yeah, that makes sense. And then one final question before we go into the rapid fire questions. You brought up the social media trolling that you've had for some of those studies. I think that one thing that comes up in particular when it comes to nutrition, because it kind of really polarizes people in a way. And this also affects science and the research world. What are some points? And one thing that I, by the way, really like about your studies is that you have those performance outcomes. So it's very clear what you're actually measuring and not some indirect marker of performance that we don't really know whether or not it will translate or how it will translate to actual performance. So that's something that that I would like to see more in research, that actually more measurements of direct performance outcomes. But what would you think? What would you want to change in the general nutrition sciences if you could, to make it a better playing field with good research methods, good reporting, and just general improvement for the nutrition sciences?
I think what you said about having the measurement of what's really important, which could be performance, it could be other aspects, but getting to direct measurements is important. But I think interpreting that we can allow for differences in responsiveness to things, or allow that there's not one single goal that people have, that we often need to think about different goals being able to be met. And so there'll never be a black and white of this is the perfect diet or this is the imperfect diet. I think if we can understand that a mix and match of different ideas, and that might change over time for the same individual, but might be different between different athletes, is likely to be closer to the truth.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for athletes and coaches that are interested in reading the research and interpreting it for themselves or for the athletes that they coach, do you have some tips for how to make correct interpretations and make the most use of actually consuming the science that is out there?
Well, I think being able to read widely and to follow experts is important, but then sometimes going to actually see the professional, the dietitian or other nutritionist that can help you to gain from the general body of knowledge what works for you is important. And that, sometimes it's good to be able to read generally, but having it being able to be tailor-made for you is part of what could be the final element that makes it work.
Perfect. So let's move into the rapid fire questions, and these ones are short and sweet, one sentence to answer them. And the first question is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to nutrition or research or endurance sports?
Oh, gosh. Well, look, I love a couple of different things. I'm a big Alex Hutchinson fan and David Epstein, but I also really love the Science of Sport website that Ross Tucker does. So between all those three, I can find something I love.
And what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Just keep at things, I think. Just, persevere. And if you can keep applying yourself and be willing to be flexible and change your ideas over the time, then that's success.
And finally, what do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your career?
I think I really value the experiences of athletes and coaches now in a way that I didn't know earlier. I probably would have suggested that scientists knew more than athletes and coaches at the beginning, but now I recognise that all of us can contribute knowledge, and when we put it all together, it's a much richer source of evidence.
Great. And finally, where can the listeners follow you and your work and keep up to date with what you've got going on?
Well, I publish quite a bit, so you can go to PubMed or you can look at the Australian Institute of Sport website and see some of our work there. And I am on Twitter with a love-hate relationship, so I often try and get there to promote some of the good work that we've done, but then have to retreat when it gets too mean and nasty.
Yeah. Okay. We'll have that linked in the show notes anyway. And listeners, be kind on Twitter. There's no need for trolling. Thank you so much, Louise, for coming on the podcast. It's been I've really wanted to talk with you a long time because I really admire the work that you've done. So it's a great pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great when we've got people that want to share it.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As usual, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. And on the show notes page, I'll link to lots of the papers that we discussed here today and papers relevant to the discussion that Louise has been involved in. And also, as related listening, I highly recommend that you go and listen to episode 181 of That Triathlon Show if you haven't already, which is the interview I did with Professor John Hawley, who is Louise's husband. And in that episode, we discussed endurance sports nutrition state of the art in 2019. And that is one of the most downloaded episodes that the podcast has. And John was a great guest, so definitely go and check that out as well. If you're interested in either individualized coaching, customized training plans, or ready-made training plans, depending on your race distance and goals, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com. We have all of those services and products available, so you can find more information through the website. And send me an email if you have any questions. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to get a personalized hydration strategy for your next race, and get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Go and have a look at their new and fantastic new wetsuits, the Maverick X2 and the Maverick MX. And you can get 20% off your order on those wetsuits or any of their other products like tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, high-performance eyewear with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.